Hi there, everyone. We're just gonna share our screen really quick here. Did I do that correctly, everybody? Okay. So my name's Ash New. I'm a news apps developer with ProPublica based in New York. Andrea?
I'm Andrea Suozzo. I'm also a news apps developer, and I'm based in Burlington, Vermont. And Logan.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Logan Jaffe. I'm based in Chicago, and I am a reporter, and I'm also on our newsletter team here at ProPublica.
And today we're talking about our project and our series, but mainly kind of the database that went along with the Repatriation Project series and the Illinois story that Logan led the reporting on. There are a few links in this slide here. If you haven't checked out the work already, those would be the stories and the series that we're covering. So feel free to try and get onto those links. So just a little bit about why we decided to report on NAGPRA, especially why at this moment, and even what NAGPRA is. NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990 by Congress, intended to help return Native American remains, funerary objects, and sacred items to federally recognized tribes. And it was part of a push around 30 years ago by Native American advocacy groups and museums and also, political representatives to protect important cultural sites in the country, and was also partially in response to kind of a national outcry over the unequal treatment of the graves of Native Americans compared to the resting places of white Americans. So that's a little bit about the history, and it was a lot, past 30 years ago. And when Congress passed it, they kind of thought that things would be returned and everything would be all right after around 5 years. That's kind of what they budgeted for and estimated for. And since then, the process has really dragged out. Repatriation is a pretty complex process in some ways. And a lot of tribes and museums have been engaged in these kind of consultations and conversations around the return of remains and funerary objects for more than 3 decades now. So ProPublica was really seeking to bring back attention and awareness to this issue because it is so pervasive and such a deep part of American history, but also one that it goes relatively unknown. The fact that, there are more than 600 institutions across the United States, universities, your local state college, your historical society, your natural history museum that have these Native American remains that have yet to be returned to tribes. And so that was pretty core to our purpose and why we galvanized around this issue. And also just in terms of timing, like there are we're seeing a generational change in museums. When the law was first passed, whoever was working in museums at the time, they hadn't started their careers with NAGPRA in place. But at this point, we're really starting to see a turnover in anthropology and archaeology, people who are curators at museums who have started their careers with this law in place and are pretty motivated to start repatriating. So just a little bit of a series overview. We've started publishing in January. These are some of the stories that have published so far. The first story, which is the big one, number 1, the number 2, which is our database, which we'll cover today and do a little demo of. 3 and 4, which are Logan's Illinois reporting. 5, which was a guide into how to report on this in your own region. And then 6, which just came out, I think this past weekend, about UC Berkeley and a professor there. And there's more to come. So that's our series. And I guess I'll do a quick demo of the database. Let's see. You guys are going to see my search history here. So quick demo of the database. This is kind of what we're looking at. I wonder if I expand. Got a little intro here, but really the main thing is the search function, which lets people kind of query for any institution, tribe, or state. So I'll just pop in Illinois here. And gives you some summary information really quickly as to the state of repatriation in Illinois. These are the institutions that have remains, institutions in Illinois that have reported having Native American remains. These are institutions that report having Native American remains taken from the state of Illinois, which is another aspect. These are tribes that have had remains returned to them from institutions, and sort of on and on it goes. And you can click into any of these institutions and get a very quick overview of what they have, where the remains were taken from, whether or not they've returned them. There's interactive maps, and you can kind of click around and see timelines of repatriation. This is the Illinois State Museum, and as some of Logan's reporting has said, they really have not made a lot of progress in repatriating, and they have the second largest collection in the United States. So this, and there are other facets to this which we can go into later, but this database is meant to give people the ability to learn about repatriation, localize it to their area, and then just even report on it. Or if you are working for a museum or are working for a university, being able to know what your institution has and get those details. So I'll go back to this. The rest of our presentation, we have a sort of deep dive into data, which I will be sort of spearheading, a section on Illinois, and which Logan will be spearheading, and then the design and development of the tool, which Andrea and I will be talking about. So I will just keep talking. Section number 1, data. So the tool that you saw in brief is based off of a couple of data sources. One which is the National Park Service's inventory database, which contains all of the records that institutions submitted to the federal government. The law requires institutions to report what they have, and then to issue these notices when they have determined that those remains will be returned to tribes or a tribe. And so this database that we got from the government is about 24,000 rows, representing each line sort of represents a different set of remains, potentially taken from one site, and along with its funerary objects that came along with it, and other information like where it was taken from. Sometimes this information has a lot of detail, like who excavated or who took it, the provenance of it, the history of that group of ancestors. Sometimes it really does not, because maybe that information was lost. And that's a challenge that a lot of museums face in trying to piece together the histories of their collections. This is just kind of a quick look at what some of those records look like. And you can see that there's various columns here. And so when we got those inventories from federal government, we knew that all of this information was self-reported and also somewhat deceptively precise. The numbers that the institutions are reporting change quite frequently, because when they're doing the counting, it's, when we talk about a single set of remains, it could be anything from a fragment of a bone to a full skeleton or other remnants of buried individuals. And so it's hard to identify exactly precisely how many people are represented in a set of remains. And so the numbers that we're citing, we like to try and round them to the nearest tens or hundreds, and also have really tried to make the point clear to people that the data that we're reporting is just what is known. There could definitely be other unreported remains, and we've heard of some cases of that happening. And then the other place that the data came from is the Federal Register notices. So when the museum or institution determines that they're going to return remains, they have to publish this Federal Register notice, this is an example of one that details sort of to whom the remains should go, what the determination was, and any other background information that is relevant. And so we were scraping these from the Federal Register. We were using that text for some extraction of the tribe names to figure out who was getting each of the remains sets of remains that had been returned. And to do that tribal extraction, this is an example of some text that is in those notices. We were just using kind of very big regular expression queries to identify certain phrases that are very commonly showing up in these notices, because there's something of a format and formula to them, so that we could grab these tribe names and connect them to these sets of remains that they had been affiliated to. So that's a little bit of background on the data. I'm going to pass it over to Logan, who's going to talk about Illinois.
Sure. Thanks, Ash.
You're muted, Logan, somehow. Well, you're not muted, but I can't.
Am I muted?
Oh, now I can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. Okay, awesome. So yeah, I'll pick it up. Thanks, Ash. So I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about the Illinois State Museum and Dixon Mounds Museum, but also a bit about how a lot of this sort of big picture data shaped how we chose and found stories within it, and also, both the institution specific stories as well as the first story that we published that kind of does a little bit of an overview. So first, I guess, my entry point to this project was from a completely unrelated story that I had just, gotten done reporting. It was in Southern Illinois, and somebody had brought to my attention that Southern Illinois University held, a pretty fair, quite a number of the remains of Native Americans, and they weren't really sure why. So one day, sooner or later after that, I, learned about what NAGPRA was. It seemed very confusing to me. Called up the National Park Service and got in touch with the person who runs the NAGPRA program. And turns out Ash had also, or was about to speak with the same person. And this person actually at the National Park Service said, hey, I think somebody else at ProPublica is interested in working on this. So yeah, collaboration. Anyway, Ash got that very big data set, and one of the earliest things that Ash did was make these sort of, I don't want to call them rudimentary. They're not rudimentary, right? These sort of prototypes, these prototypes of that visualized some of the data that we were dealing with. And, immediately to me, first of all, I live in Chicago. I was kind of shocked that the Illinois State Museum, of all places, had the number of remains that they did. And so that was sort of, that was very surprising to me. But this data visualization was a really handy and very useful tool for me and my colleagues as we were thinking about how to go about this project. So for me, yeah, seeing that number of remains and that 2% were only made available for repatriation immediately led me to ask the question, like, what the hell, like, why? So that explaining why those numbers are the way they are kind of became the heart of, I guess, like my reporting process. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, okay. So this is a screenshot from, you know, the already published tool, but you can see, going back to the importance of the data in this, is that this is where the county information was really important to shaping how we went about doing this story. So you can see a pretty big spike in this one particular county, which is, you know, Fulton County, Illinois. It's a county that's along the Illinois River. And, you know, knew nothing about Fulton County. And then we can go to the next slide. I learned that in Fulton County, that's where the Digs and Mounds Museum is. And Digs and Mounds Museum is a state institution that is kind of, you know, it's part of the Illinois State Museum system. So the numbers of the Illinois State Museum also include Digs and Mounds Museum. So using some of the information from the raw data that we had, it includes collection history notes. So I started kind of learning about where these, you know, excavations had happened, and, you know, who had done them, and again, where they were happening. And, you know, the goal in many ways, again, was to like intertwine some of that history, but explaining that number kind of led to, I guess, a story that I wasn't really expecting. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so to better explain some of those numbers, so the first photo that you see right here is the inventory of culturally unidentifiable human remains. So this is a very early inventory from 1995 that the museum had submitted to the National Park Service. And what this is it kind of is a more narrative explanation written by the museum about what's in their collection, why those numbers are the way that they are. And what we learned is that the museum had this sort of strategy for a time where they would categorize any human remains that predated the year 1673 as culturally unidentifiable. So 1673 is, you know, the year that, you know, French explorers basically like came into the state, to what became the state of Illinois. And this is what archaeologists referred to as the historic era, was 1673 to the present. And before that is, you know, before 1673. And culturally unidentifiable is a term that the law itself, that NAGPRA defines. And it basically means that the museum is under the impression that none of these human remains that they share a group identity with any modern tribes. So the law only requires institutions to repatriate remains that are culturally affiliated. So by categorizing, using this criteria and categorizing, I think it was 98.4% of their inventory as culturally unidentifiable, it kind of gave them an out under the law. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, basically the question then became, okay, well, why wouldn't you just return them regardless? Like, what's the value? Why would you not want to return some of these? And then that's what led me to, you know, investigating more of the what was going on. So I think I'm probably over time in talking about this part, But zooming out, so that kind of shapes the Illinois story. And then kind of, if you like kind of using that same data visualization from the beginning, we decided to write another story that focused on sort of that bottom right cluster of large red circles to see if there were any similarities and trends in in those institutions. So we started writing institution profiles of, kind of the top 10 places that had the most remains. And that's what became, the story that we ran with first. But because we knew that this was so tied to the data and we had this amazing tool that Ash and Andrea were developing, we really wanted to intertwine and invite people to interact with that data in the first story that we published. So these were all sort of like editorial and design and data choices coming together in the first story that we published to kind of represent our work, but also the process of our work and the things that are available to a reader or a user. And so I'll hand it off to you all. This is the list of the 10 institutions that hold the most unrepatriated remains in the country. So that's what that story became. So I'll hand it back off, and we can talk a bit more about design and development.
Thanks, Logan. So as Logan was saying, some of the prototypes early on that we developed using the data that we had gotten from the federal government were pretty crucial to the development of, to the reporting that we were doing and to seeding the stories that we ended up publishing. So these are some of the observable prototypes that I built using that NAGPRA inventory data. In the top left-hand corner, it's a version of what became the map on the institution pages that we now have. So very early on, we had this idea of being able to look up institutions and seeing the spread of where they had taken remains from, which is quite important for these very large universities, which spent a lot of time in kind of the 19th century trying to collect in an encyclopedic way the remains of Native Americans from all across the country. And you can sort of see that with Harvard here. And then other visualizations and prototypes that helped our reporters understand some of the timelines and patterns and trends as to why institutions, some of them had remains, some of them didn't. We're basically trying to answer that question as to why some institutions have repatriated and some hadn't. And by slicing and dicing the inventory data, we could get a better picture of that. And then after doing those observables, those were in our pitch decks kind of to our reporters or our editors at the beginning to get a green light. But once we moved into a more intermediate stage with the project, we needed to come up with real mock-ups as to what the whole page and interface would look like for this tool that we were envisioning. And keeping in mind that we had several audiences for this tool, the public was a huge one. Tribes and museum staff who work very intimately on NAGPRA were another group. And then reporters were another group, or researchers, people who wanted to use this tool to do their own investigations. We've seen a lot of that and have encouraged a lot of that because we know that this is a national story, but it's also deeply local. All of these places have their own very nuanced histories. And so all that kind of went into these mock-ups that we were putting together to try and envision what the final tool would look like. And you can see that some of the elements here, if you've looked at the published version, many of the elements are quite similar to what ended up being published. Some of them have changed, but doing this helped us kind of get alignment and agreement and work out some kinks as to what wasn't working. You might notice that we cut this chart or reduced some of the complexity in this one, or even cut this table, reduce the complexity in this globe map, etc. But elements like this progress bar and some of the language that we have here was carried over. So I'm going to pass it along to Andrea for tooling, which is the more technical side of things.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the tools we used once we got around to actually building this database. For a little bit of sort of timeline context, I believe Ash pitched this story in early 2021, or, the focusing on digging into repatriation. And I came onto the project, I believe, in June or July of 2022. So it was well underway before we began actually building the tool. And, there were many iterations of the observable graphics that, made it a lot easier for me to figure out where we were at when I came onto the project. So to actually build this tool, we used this very cool node-based site generator called Baker. It is a project that was originally built by the LA Times. We've sort of adapted it to use our own stylings, to use some of our own analytics rig, some of our in-house kind of our headers and footers. So we have a customized version of it, but at its core, what it does is it basically writes out HTML pages to static, so you don't have to host a database. You're just hosting static pages on the internet. That's a lot cheaper to run, many fewer vulnerabilities, which is lovely. I also run Nonprofit Explorer, which is far too large to be a static site, and it comes with a lot more headaches. So Baker is a lovely little app for kind of the smaller scope projects where you're not trying to build out a million pages. And one of the really cool things about it as well is that it uses a tool called Quaff, which just ingests data from a data folder, and that data can be in any format. It can be in JSON, it can be CSVs. So you don't actually ever need a database at any point in the process. And because a lot of the underlying data that Ash already had was in CSVs, it was very easy for us to just move those into this project and just generate pages for every institution just based on a data file that we already had. So it made a lot of things pretty smooth to get up and running. It was also the first project we were using this rig for, so there was a learning curve, kind of just figuring out our way around it. So I believe next on the next slide, so we baked out a lot of the core stuff to static. We used Svelte to handle anything that needed to be dynamic. So search results. This is a little Svelte component that just does a type ahead. I believe Svelte runs the animation at the top of the homepage where it sort of fades in as you scroll, and also the charts. And on the next slide, we also used that might have gotten delayed. We also used a Svelte framework called Layer Cake, which is built on top of, it's a Svelte graphics framework. And if you've ever used D3 or another charting tool like that, it can be really, really painful to make charts responsive so that when someone loads it on mobile, it looks right, it scales correctly, versus when someone loads it on desktop. And so Layer Cake sort of sits in the middle and handles that for you. So it's a lovely little framework. It was the first time I had used it personally. And then once we had gotten all the technical stuff up and running, happy to answer more of those go into more detail in the Q&A portion. But once we got all of that stuff put together, one of the things that we made sure to do was user testing, and Ash can talk a little bit about that. There was
Yeah,
my layer cake
sorry,
slide.
I did the slides wrong. But for user testing, that was a really important part of our process. We needed to make sure, even early on, that we were meeting some of the needs that our various user groups had, and not also this being a very sensitive subject, that we weren't putting out information or data in ways that would have come into conflict or been uncomfortable for tribes especially. So at the latter end of things in our process with user testing, we were doing things like usability testing, making sure that our language was understandable to people, the complexity of the topic, because it is quite niche for some people. We were trying to both have our tool and content be suitable for people who are like experts in the topic and people who know nothing about the topic. And straddling those two is a challenge. And the other thing that we did with user testing as well was just have people like literally, we would hand them the live site, have them talk through what they were thinking, you know, use their mouse and use the search function, go over any charts, try and test the interactivity on those to find any bugs. And that all ended up being super valuable feedback for us as we closed the project out. And then with the publication, one of the things that we were trying to do was really raise awareness about this topic. And part of that was with local impact, and I'll let Logan sort of wrap things up.
Yeah, I mean, this was an amazing, thing to see, and something we couldn't necessarily have all the way planned for. But if we go to the next slide, this is just a kind of a sample of headlines that have been and stories that have been published all around the country. And I mean, in my opinion, I think part of the success of this is a testament to the news app itself and the design and care and thought that Andrea and Ash really put into this. So, I think that it being as, intuitive to use as it was has also helped raise awareness about, our reporting, but also just about the law in general. That's it.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just add on top of that is that I think, as local newsrooms especially are sort of lacking the resources to do these larger development and data projects, ProPublica is really, I think, as an organization, really interested in partnering with local organizations and generally making tools like this accessible to local reporters. So it's something that I think as a whole, the organization really tries to support. So I think with that, we'll take questions. I don't know from where they will come, but
yeah, well, so thanks, y'all. So we'll be looking at our YouTube chat for questions. Just want to really encourage folks, if somehow you haven't interacted with the site yet, please do. It's an awesome experience, and it is really neat to search and to get a little bit more information. I think I can start us off with one of the first audience questions, which is, have you received any feedback or consult from tribes in the development and continued life of this project?
yeah, I can take that question. We definitely were talking with tribal representatives throughout the whole process. Even at the very beginning, we reached out to a variety of like organizations or individual tribal historic preservation officers or cultural heritage representatives who work most intimately with NAGPRA, because definitely acknowledging that like this has been around for more than 3 decades. People have been working on this for a very long time and have deep expertise in it. And so we, part of the reason that we initially took on this project was that we heard from a lot of tribes that they just don't have the resources or the time to keep track necessarily of which institutions have remains that could be relevant to their traditional territories. And so we hope that the tool helps facilitate repatriation in those ways. We also have those tribe pages. I didn't get to quite demo that, but I could probably just really quickly show you that. I mean, a huge portion of this project actually was making it possible to search this data by tribe. The federal government data actually is only searchable through institution, and that's a function of the reporting, the way that the law is written and how the reporting works. And we felt it was very important for this to be, for you to be able to see this through the tribal's perspective. So this is one of the tribal nations that has historic traditional territories in Illinois. And you can kind of see that these are some of the regions in which remains have been made available for repatriation to the Peoria tribe. So you can kind of get a sense of where they've been contacted for and consulted with on repatriation. And then we have sort of a timeline. You can see sort of the progress made over time and some of the institutions that might have remains that are relevant to the tribe that still have yet to be repatriated. So on this list, Indiana University is a fair number that they have not repatriated from territories that are related to the tribe. So definitely something that we have kept in mind, and as we go forward with our reporting in the series, we're continuing to talk to the sources that we've developed over the past year or so.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of leads into another question that we had, which was, have you had any responses from tribes or any cases of like family members looking for like remains of their ancestors? Just curious there.
I don't think we've gotten any responses specifically from individuals who are looking for family members. I will say that there's been a lot of recent reporting about the schools, like boarding schools, and the grave sites that were on these boarding school areas, and that actually so NAGPRA only extends to federally funded institutions, so there are limitations to it. A lot of boarding schools actually, based as to how they were like passed down, the properties and so forth, some of them don't fall under NAGPRA. And so it's kind of like an intersection between NAGPRA and boarding schools. And I think, generally speaking, with remains, the age of them can really range from, relatively recent to several thousand years. And so there's a wide sort of span of time and generations there. I don't know if anyone else has something to add on that.
I can go ahead and ask the next question. Thank you. Regarding Illinois cataloging pre-1673, Illinois cataloging
Cameron is breaking up from
set of remain belongs to.
Sorry, we didn't hear the whole question, Cameron. You were breaking up a bit.
Yeah, so regarding Illinois cataloging pre-1673 remains as unaffiliated, is there any way to determine which tribe a given set of remains belongs to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And definitely there are definitely ways to do this. So the law itself has many different forms of evidence that it lists out as, being acceptable to evaluate when making, a determination of cultural affiliation. A big one is geography. So if a tribe has, like land claims in a particular area, or like any sort of like ties that way, then that alone is sort of can be seen as a permissible form of evidence. So NAGPRA does not say that you need absolute certainty that like this particular tribe are literally like biologically related to the ancestors that are held by an institution. In fact, that's like that sort of perception that you need that sort of level of evidence is part of what we found was, holding the museum back and many other museums from actually just returning. So, the process can be as complicated as a museum sometimes wants to make it. And there's a lot of different perspectives on, how complicated or not complicated repatriation can be. And if sometimes, if you want to repatriate through geography, or if you read the Illinois story, which is even an aspect of the story that I didn't even really talk about, but what the museum is trying to do right now is sort of develop a sort of its own methodology for how to go about repatriation at a large scale. So hopefully, that might, speed up the pace of repatriation, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll also add to that the way that the law is written really emphasized in the beginning cultural affiliation, which is a very specific term. It's like a relationship of shared group identity is what's in the law. And like Logan was saying, there are multiple lines of evidence that can be used for that, but you only need a preponderance of evidence, which means over 50%. So it's like more than 50% is not a very high bar, legally speaking. But because of the sort of scientific orientation of a lot of institutions, some of the more like oral history or traditional knowledge and geography, those kinds of lines of evidence have been weighted less in the determinations that a lot of institutions have made. And we're seeing some change in that. And I think the way that new regulations are being proposed, and those are much more emphasizing geographic connection to land above the sort of higher bar of cultural affiliation.
Awesome. I have another audience question that just came in. Can you share any technical details about how the database is kept up to date? For example, do you scrape the web or manually update the ingested CSVs, or like a mix of something like that?
Yeah, so we actually haven't made an update to the data since we published. So you might note that on the website, it says that the data is from December 9th. And that's because we need to go over the data as we get it from the federal government and review it for errors and do the tribal extraction. So it is a manual process. It's a spreadsheet that we get from the Department of Interior, and then we do some data processing on that and spin it up into our own CSVs, which get served up in that static site generator.
And we do have a relatively robust bulletproofing process because we don't want to publish information that's inaccurate. So we'll tend to kind of export samples of the data and have try to get as many members of our team or kind of folks in the newsroom to just look over it and compare it to the source data and make sure that it is not, that there are no mistakes that we're making.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for about one more question. So I'll ask the last audience question here. with such a large amount of remains to be returned, has the capacity of tribes to accept remains been a roadblock? Do museums generally assist in the logistics of rehousing?
That's a really great question, and something that we hope the tribal pages help sort of answer. It's a lot of work to do this, like you're sort of noting. Tribes have been contacted in some cases by dozens, hundreds of museums or institutions, and keeping track of all of that can be quite difficult. There's also no actual funding that is dedicated specifically to NAGPRA. So tribal historic preservation officers get their funding from the Historic Preservation Act, but that actually none of that funding can explicitly be used for NAGPRA. It has to be used for other things like Section 106 and all of that. So oftentimes tribes, it's, maybe one person, if that, who's part-time working on NAGPRA and has a lot of other pressing responsibilities to get to. So funding is a huge issue that we see. And kind of like you're mentioning, sort of the resources to travel to these institutions is one thing. A lot of tribes are not actually located in the general region that institutions are, if the institution has taken remains from clear across the country, and that travel cost getting sort of elders to the museum or vice versa can be quite a burden. And then finally, with the actual physical return and repatriation as well, sometimes their reservation land is limited, or maybe they don't have reservation land, or maybe they don't have a secure site for burial because there is sort of ongoing looting. These are all problems that tribes regularly face and are definite barriers to repatriation.
Thank you for answering audience questions here. It sounds like a lot of challenges remain, but we're really glad that this reporting is out there and that folks have been engaging with this story. So thanks to our presenters for sharing that story with us here at Shy Hack Night. I think we have one more brief announcement slide here before moving to the next activity. So I'll read that briefly. So we have our post presentation, intros, announcements, and breakout group pitches here in just a moment. You can find that link at bit.ly/chn-remote-zoom. And I think, Shreya, is there anything that I missed?
No, I think that covers it. Yeah, I want to echo that. It was a really great presentation, and thank you so much for coming out today.
All right, then I think with that, we'll send off with our usual goodbye and go forth and